كنت غادي نلعبوا واحد اللعبه اليوم غادي نلعبوا ماينكرافت سيرفر ايميرالد كرافت الحلقه الثانيه. كنتمنى تعجبكم. الا عجبتكم ما تنساش تحط واحد اللايك سبسكرايب وشارك في القناه ما كنتيش مشترك ونبدا في الفيديو. طبعا ايمن نزل فيديو ديال رياكشن شافني نزلت رياكشن درت رياكشن وبغيت نشكركم على 60 مشترك. حرفيا فرحت. و60 مشترك تبعها 61 مشترك، يعني قمة الفرحة اللي غادي تحس اللي حاس بها حتى دابا لا توقع. الدراري تعلموا من المحترفين. تعريق سبايدر هنا. عندي بلوكات. عندي اوكي يا الله. والله والله تنقصر 4 بلوكات. إلا درتها لايك إلا درت هادي لايك 4 بلوكات. إلا درتها لايك هاد الحركة يا الله. المهم دراري عرفتوها. اوكي انا نصغرت عليكم. ويا دراري شوفوا درتها ولكن ما كملتش الباركور. ماشي خاكم محترف. المهم الدراري بغيت نوريكم شي حاجه انني غادي ندير لكم مونتاجات. غادي نوريكم وغادي نرجعوا لماينكرافت. الدراري عندنا هذا
1000 years later.
دقيقه قالوا لي
2000 years later. 2000 years later. 6.5 hours.
عندنا اوكي ده كامل. اوكي
2000 years later. 6.5 hours later. A few inches later. Day 2, day 3, day 4. A few moments later. 1 eternity later. 3 days later. 12 seconds later. 3:28 a.m. 3 weeks later. Many months later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
Tomorrow for sure. Eventually, 12 o'clock midnight. 2 hours later. Meanwhile, 8:01 p.m. The next day later. 20 minutes later.
اوكي عندنا هذه مثلا
2000 years later. 1 hour later. Much later.
اوكي
2000 years later. 6.5 hours later. A few inches later. Day 2.
اوكي دقيقة دابا
years later. 6.5 hours later. A few inches later. Day 2, day 3, day 4. A few moments later, 1 eternity later. 3 days later, 12 seconds later, 3:28 a.m. 3 weeks later, many months later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
Tomorrow for sure. Eventually, 12 o'clock midnight. 1 hour later. 2 hours later. 3 hours later. While Patchy pulls himself together, let's see how SpongeBob's party is shaping up. Meanwhile, 2 hours later, 8:01 p.m. The next day. Later, 20 minutes later, 6 hours later, several bad puns later.
70 years later.
Meanwhile, 6 hours later. Later that same evening, several days later. 6 months later. 2 hours later. 1 minute, 37 seconds later. 1 debt to society later. 4 to 6 weeks later. 1 pair of pants later. 8 hours later. 298 frozen patties later. 3 hours later. Epilogue. The next day, 10 seconds later, 346 minutes later, much later. Meanwhile, at the Krusty Krab, 3 days later, opening night later, 3,000 years later, 1 week later, 7:59 a.m. 3 weeks later, 3 days later, 2 hours later, 2 hours later, 48 hours later, 8 hours later. The following Thursday, 5 minutes later, 24 hours later, much later, much later, 7 hours later, epilogue. Several song-filled hours later, a few minutes later, a little longer than a few minutes later, 2 hours later, 3 days later, 15 minutes later, several months later, thousands of tears later, 16 paranoia-filled days later, 2 hours later, much later. Yesterday, many hours later, 75 years later, 2 hours later.
طبعا ده كان نشوفه مش الموقع.
Shift later, 2 very boring minutes later, 3 hours later, 1 winner later. The following day.
وقال هذا خلينا نخلي الناس اللي يبغوا يمونطي وقال ما عندي كرافت عند الزر. لا وقال غادي تسالي هذا وغادي
This brief construction montage. Meanwhile, back in the lowland, 1 frozen wasteland later, 1 hour later, 5 hours later, 2 days later, in the void, approximately 10 hours later, early the next morning, 1 shift later, 2 weeks
Shift?
later, 11 minutes later, 5 minutes later, a lot of boring math later, 24 hours later, 1 week later, 1 long angry line later, 72 hours later, 2
هاد الفيديو غادي نمونطي.
Just then, by sheer coincidence, the next morning, montage. The next morning, many tic-tacs later, flashback, and a flashback. The very next evening, 1 hour later. The next day, later, 4 to 6 days later, 4 to 6 more days later. The next morning,
نلاحظ بعض الحوايج كيتعاودوا.
later, 1 semester later, graduation day.
1 hour later.
80,000 impressions later. Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying. 3,000 whoop-whoos later. Soon after. Later. Moments later. The next morning. Many unbearable hours later.
The end. كتمنى يعجبكم الفيديو.